The hush that fell over Hazelton Prime's dining room was the kind that only happens when something has gone very, very wrong. One moment, the Friday evening crowd was doing what wealthy Calgarians do best, murmuring over steelhead trout and aged Bordeaux, conducting the quiet theatre of old money. The next, a security guard named Dale Pruitt was standing over a corner table, with his chest puffed out and his hand pressed flat against the white linen tablecloth, blocking the seated woman from her meal like he owned the building and everything in it. He didn't own the building, but the woman he was leaning over, she came close. Major Celestine Adeyemi-Wray had arrived at Hazelton Prime 40 minutes earlier, in a way that she always arrived at places, without announcement, without performance, and without any interest in being noticed. She was 44, with the kind of measured stillness that takes years of pressure to build. She'd spent 2 decades in the Canadian Armed Forces, the last 7 embedded with Joint Task Force 2, the country's most secretive and elite special operations unit. She had run night operations in Mali, advised NATO intelligence partners in Latvia, and once spent 11 days in the Kandahar dust pulling a fractured coalition unit back from the edge of collapse through sheer force of will and tactical precision. Tonight she was wearing a deep plum blazer over a cream blouse and eating a plate of seared halibut, alone and unbothered, waiting for her mentor and commanding officer, Brigadier-General Yvonne Marchand, who had stepped outside to take a call from Ottawa. Celestine's table was in the far corner facing the room. That was habit. You always sit facing the room. You always know where the exits are. You always notice who walks in, why they're moving differently from everyone else and what their hands are doing. So she had clocked Dale Pruitt, the moment he came through the side door from the hotel corridor, the way he moved across the floor with his shoulders squared, his eyes scanning not for threats but for targets, the particular brand of arrogance that belongs to a man who has just enough authority to feel untouchable, and not nearly enough judgment to know when to stop. She'd watched him pass 3 other tables without slowing down. She'd watched his gaze land on her, and she'd placed her fork down quietly, folded her hands in her lap and waited. "Excuse me." Pruitt's voice was louder than necessary for a restaurant like this. The couple at the next table looked up. "I'm going to need to see your hotel key or a reservation confirmation." Celestine looked at him evenly. "Good evening, I have a dinner reservation. The hostess seated me." "We've had reports," Pruitt said, leaning closer, dropping his voice in a way that wasn't actually quieter but was meant to feel like he was being discreet, "of an unauthorized individual in the dining area. I need to verify that you belong here." The phrase sat in the air between them. "I belong here," Celestine said, "because I have a reservation under Adeyemi-Wray. You're welcome to check with the front desk." Pruitt straightened up. He hooked his thumbs into his belt, a move so rehearsed it had become unconscious. "I'd rather you come with me to the lobby and we sort this out there, quietly." "I'm in the middle of dinner." "Ma'am." "I am not going to the lobby." Her voice was entirely without heat. It was the voice she used when a situation required clarity rather than escalation. Precise, flat, final. "If there is a genuine concern about my reservation, the hostess who seated me is 20 feet away. You are welcome to speak with her, but I am not leaving this table." Something shifted in Pruitt's face. Not uncertainty, something worse. The look of a man who had decided that being questioned was equivalent to being threatened. He pulled a radio from his belt. "I'm going to need you to come with me, or I'm calling the hotel duty manager and the Calgary police." "Then call them," Celestine said, and picked up her fork. The table next to her had gone completely still. An older man in a blazer was staring openly. A woman across the room had her phone angled in a way that was not quite subtle. Pruitt noticed none of it. He was already raising the radio, already constructing in his mind the version of this story, where he was the one maintaining order, where she was the disruption, where the color of her skin and the boldness of her refusal were one and the same problem. What he didn't notice, because he had never developed the habit of watching doors, was the woman who had just walked back in from the hotel lobby. Brigadier-General Yvonne Marchand was 61 years old, silver-haired, and dressed in a charcoal wool blazer with a small Canadian Forces lapel pin that caught the light above the left breast pocket. She had the bearing of someone who had spent 4 decades being the most prepared person in any room she entered. She took in the scene in approximately 1.5 seconds. The security guard at Celestine's table, the radio in his hand, the particular quality of Celestine's stillness, and she crossed the dining room without hurrying. Pruitt heard her before he saw her. The sound of her heels on the hardwood was unhurried and deliberate. "What is the problem here?" Marchand's voice was not loud. It had no need to be. Pruitt turned. He saw a tall white-haired woman in her 60s and briefly recalibrated downward. "Ma'am, This is a private matter between me and... I am Brigadier-General Yvonne Marchand of the Canadian Armed Forces. She didn't produce identification. She didn't need to. The woman you are currently harassing is Major Celestine Adeyemi-Wray, a 20-year veteran of the CAF and a serving member of Joint Task Force 2. She has a valid dinner reservation, as does she have my personal assurance that she has been seated at this table for the past 40 minutes, because she ordered the halibut before I stepped outside. Now. Marchand tilted her head slightly. I would like you to tell me, slowly and carefully, what unauthorized report brought you to this table. Pruitt's radio hand dropped. The words that came out of his mouth next were the most damaging thing he could have possibly said. Someone at the bar reported a woman matching her description who didn't look like a hotel guest. The silence that followed was of a different quality than before. Celestine set her fork down again, but this time she didn't pick it up. Marchand looked at Pruitt for a long moment. Then she reached into the inner pocket of her blazer and withdrew her phone. I want the name of your duty manager, she said, and I want them here in the next 3 minutes, and then I want to speak to the general manager of this hotel. She was already dialing as she spoke, but first I have a call to make. The call she made was not to the hotel. It was to Superintendent Gerald Forsyth of the Calgary Police Service, with whom she had worked on a federal security coordination file the previous spring. She did not put the call on speaker. She didn't need to. In the silence of the restaurant, several nearby tables caught the words Brigadier-General Marchand, racial harassment, and Major Adeyemi-Wray, JTF2, before she lowered her voice into a professional register and continued. Pruitt stood at the edge of the table for those 2 minutes, looking like a man watching the walls of a room he'd voluntarily locked himself into begin to press inward. Celestine, for her part, finished her halibut. She had learned a long time ago that the people who needed the most visible reaction from you were precisely the ones who deserved the least of your energy. She had faced down men with automatic weapons in low-light environments in 3 countries. Dale Pruitt and his radio were a Tuesday afternoon inconvenience. What she felt, watching him stand there unraveling, was not satisfaction. It was the specific tired clarity of a person who has lived this scene too many times to be surprised by it anymore, only by the faces. The duty manager, a young man named Asher Tran, who clearly had been having a very normal Friday until 7 minutes ago, arrived at the table with the kind of expression that suggested he was already composing a mental incident report. Asher took one look at Marchand, one look at Pruitt, and appeared to age visibly. General Marchand, Asher said, I am so deeply sorry. Can you walk me through what happened? Marchand did, concisely and without embellishment. She was precise in the way of someone who had filed operational reports for 20 years, dates, sequence of events, exact words. Pruitt attempted twice to interject with a reframing. Both times, Asher gently but firmly cut him off. Mr. Pruitt, Asher said when Marchand had finished, you are going to come with me. Please give me your radio and your access badge. The radio went on the table. The badge came off the lanyard with a small, humiliating click. Pruitt looked once more at Celestine, who was sipping her water and not looking at him, and then he followed the duty manager toward the back of the restaurant and out of the dining room. The applause started from the bar. 1 person, then 3, then a quiet ripple of it moving across the room that was not triumphant so much as it was relieved, the sound of 50 people collectively exhaling. Marchand sat down across from Celestine, unfolded her napkin, and flagged down the sommelier for a second glass. Your halibut looked good, she said. It was. Celestine paused. You didn't have to do that. I know. Marchand accepted the wine. But you've been fighting battles that should have already been won since the day you joined. I think for once you're allowed to let someone else carry the radio. Celestine was quiet for a moment. Outside the restaurant's tall windows, the Calgary evening was doing what Calgary evenings in October do. The first dusting of snow catching orange under the streetlights, the city pressing on in its particular unhurried way. He said she didn't look like a hotel guest, Celestine said. Yes, he did say that. He meant it too. He wasn't confused. There was no miscommunication. No, Marchand agreed, there wasn't. That distinction mattered. It always mattered. There is a particular exhaustion that comes not from isolated incidents, but from the cumulative weight of a pattern, the 10,000 small signals across a career and a life that tell you the world is still deciding whether your presence is legitimate. Celestine had learned to carry that weight without letting it alter her posture. She had served with soldiers who had her back unconditionally in the field, and then said something at a base barbecue that made her understand the difference between professional respect and actual equality. She had risen through the ranks faster than almost anyone in her cohort, And still, on a Friday night in a restaurant, someone could look at her blazer and her posture and her ordered meal and see only a descriptor on a report. Woman who didn't look like she belonged. What Dale Pruitt had not known, what men like Dale Pruitt never seemed to know, was that she had made a very deliberate decision years ago about how to respond to exactly this kind of moment. She would not perform distress. She would not escalate beyond what the situation required. She would use the law, the facts, and her own steadiness as the only weapons she needed, because she had learned that a calm and immovable person is almost always more frightening to a bully than an angry one. And if that wasn't enough, she would let the weight of the institution she served speak for itself. The institution had spoken this time with Marchand's voice, but it would have spoken eventually regardless. Celestine had already been composing the formal complaint in the back of her mind before the Brigadier-General had even walked in from the lobby. The general manager of Hazelton Prime, a composed woman named Claire Ouellet, appeared at their table before the dessert menus arrived. She sat down, she apologized without deflection or qualification. She confirmed that Pruitt's employment had been suspended pending a full review, and she told Celestine that the hotel's legal team would be reaching out regarding any formal complaint she chose to file. Claire looked like someone who understood that the next 72 hours were going to be very complicated for her hotel, and who had decided to meet that complication with honesty rather than damage control. Celestine thanked her and meant it. What neither she nor Marchand knew yet was that the review would become significantly more complicated when Claire's team pulled the CCTV footage and cross-referenced it with the incident log. The report from someone at the bar that Pruitt had cited turned out to be a report he had filed himself. A brief notation in the hotel security system time-stamped 11 minutes before he approached Celestine's table. The notation read, "Suspicious individual in dining area, possible unauthorized access." The CCTV showed Celestine arriving through the front entrance, being greeted by the hostess by name, and being walked directly to her table. The footage also showed Pruitt, in that 11-minute window, watching her from the corridor entrance, watching, and then writing the note, and then walking over. There was no report from the bar. There had never been a report from the bar. He had manufactured the justification after he had already decided on the action. The investigator from the hotel's HR firm who uncovered this spent 20 minutes sitting quietly with the footage before she called Claire Ouellet. She had been in HR for 16 years and had handled a significant number of misconduct cases, and she said later that it was the timestamp that got her, the 11-minute gap between what he saw and what he wrote, the deliberate construction of a paper trail that didn't match reality. He hadn't acted on instinct, he had planned it. By the following Tuesday, Pruitt's suspension had become a termination. The hotel had also filed a formal report with the Alberta Human Rights Commission. Celestine's legal team, not with anger, but with the methodical thoroughness of someone who understood how systems work, had filed a separate complaint with the Commission citing discrimination of the Alberta Human Rights Act on the basis of race and colour. The complaint was accompanied by a timeline, witness statements from 4 other diners who had provided contact information unprompted, and the hotel's own CCTV footage, which Claire had released without being asked. The hotel union that Pruitt had been a member of initially indicated they would contest the termination. They withdrew that position within 48 hours after reviewing the same footage. The human rights complaint took 8 months to resolve. The commission found in Celestine's favour. Pruitt was ordered to pay a personal fine, complete mandatory anti-discrimination training, and provide a written apology. The hotel implemented a full review of its security protocols and brought in an external equity consultant to audit its hiring and conduct policy. Hazelton Prime also made a public statement, which was more detailed and more direct than most corporate public statements tend to be, acknowledging specifically that a black woman had been targeted by a member of their security staff based on racial assumption, and that they were committed to ensuring it would not happen again. Celestine did not attend a press conference. She did not give interviews. She was in Petawawa for training the week the statement came out, and she found out about it from Marchand via a 3-word text message that read, "Statement's out. Good." She read it once, put her phone in her pocket, and went back to what she was doing. She had not fought this particular fight for the recognition. She had fought it because she knew, with the same certainty she brought to every operational decision, that the battles you don't fight in the open have a way of going underground and continuing to do damage in the dark. Every complaint she had ever filed, every formal channel she had ever used, every time she had refused to simply absorb an indignity and move on, was not about her own anger. It was about the next person. The junior officer who would sit in a restaurant 6 months from now and wonder if she had the right to stay in her chair. The soldier who didn't know yet that the law was on her side, that the institution could speak for her, that she did not have to perform submission to people who were confusing a uniform with the full measure of her worth. The fight was never just about one dinner. Marchand sent one more text the following week. It contained a screenshot of a news article about a city-wide security staff equity training initiative that the Hotel Association had announced, citing the Hazelton Prime case as the catalyst. Beneath the screenshot, Marchand had written, 11 minutes, one time-stamped lie, and now 400 security staff in this city are going to spend a mandatory 6 hours learning what they got wrong. You did that by refusing to stand up. Celestine read it twice. There is a particular kind of justice that doesn't arrive with a gavel strike or a round of applause in a restaurant. It arrives quietly, in policy documents and training calendars, and the slow, uncomfortable restructuring of the systems that allowed the harm in the first place. It is less satisfying, in the immediate sense, than watching someone escorted out of a room, but it lasts longer, and it protects people you will never meet. Dale Pruitt had walked into Hazelton Prime on a Friday evening believing he had found an easy target. A woman sitting alone, far from home ground, unlikely to have the resources or the institutional backing to make his life complicated. He had been so focused on what he assumed she lacked that it had never occurred to him to wonder what she carried. She carried 20 years of training in environments where arrogance gets people killed. She carried a mentor who had spent 4 decades making sure the institution she loved lived up to what it claimed to stand for. She carried the knowledge of exactly how the complaint process worked and the patience to use it correctly. And she carried the particular unshakable stillness of a person who has decided, a long time ago, that her presence does not require anyone's permission. She had not needed a Brigadier-General to walk through that door. She had been ready to fight this, quietly and methodically, and without drama, entirely on her own. The Brigadier-General just meant she didn't have to eat the rest of her halibut alone. If this story stayed with you, if you recognized something in Celestine's stillness, in the gap between what Pruitt saw and what was actually there, then share it. Someone in your life needs to be reminded that composure is not the same thing as compliance, and that the people who count on your silence are counting on the wrong thing. Hit like, subscribe to Voices of Courage, and come back for the next story. We'll be here. I keep thinking about that 11-minute gap. Not the moment Pruitt walked over to Celestine's table, not the applause from the bar, or the zip of the access badge coming off the lanyard. What stays with me is the 11 minutes he spent watching her, sitting quietly, eating her halibut, completely unaware she was being studied. While he typed a report that didn't match anything in front of him, he manufactured a reason after he had already made a decision. That's not a mistake, that's a choice. And choices like that have a way of becoming the most honest thing a person ever reveals about themselves. What strikes me about Celestine is that she already knew. The moment Pruitt crossed that dining room, she had read him completely. The posture, the grip on the radio, the fixed direction of his stare. She'd spent 20 years training her mind to assess threats in environments where a wrong read could be fatal. And yet she set her fork down, folded her hands, and waited. Not because she was passive, because she understood something that people like Pruitt never do, that the person who stays calm holds all the power in the room. That composure, real composure earned through years of pressure and discipline, is one of the most disorienting things you can show someone who is counting on your fear. That's what I think about when I think about integrity, not the dramatic version of it, not the speech or the confrontation, but the quiet version. The choice to remain exactly who you are when someone is actively trying to shrink you. Celestine didn't perform outrage. She didn't escalate. She used her knowledge of the law, her clear account of her own presence at that table, and her refusal to be moved. That is a kind of moral discipline that most of us never have to test at that level. And watching how she held it, I find that more impressive than anything else in this story. The part that gets me about Marchand is different. She walked in, read the room in a second and a half, and acted, not to protect her own authority, not for the optics, because she had spent 4 decades in an institution that asked people to put their lives behind its values, and she had decided a long time ago that she would hold it to those values in return. There's a kind of intelligence in that, knowing which battles to fight not because you have to, but because you understand what they cost when you don't. And then there's what came after. 400 security staff across Calgary sitting through 6 hours of mandatory training because one woman refused to leave her chair. That's not a coincidence. That's cause and effect working the way it's supposed to, slowly and without fanfare, through the mechanisms we built for exactly this purpose. Celestine used every formal channel available to her, the complaint, the legal team, the Human Rights Commission, with the same steady, methodical patience she brought to every operational decision. That takes a specific kind of endurance, the kind that doesn't burn bright and fast but holds even when nothing seems to be moving. I think about the person who sat down at a restaurant table 6 months after this, in a city that was just a little bit different because of what Celestine chose to do. That person will never know her name. She didn't do it for them to know. She did it because she understood that the fight was never just about one dinner, and that the people who count on your silence are counting on the wrong thing.